Justices are now allowing the Trump administration to put a ban on most refugees. The Supreme Court allowing the Trump administration to maintain its restrictive policy on refugees. Greg, let me ask you about this. This is big breaking news. It's coming over just right now.
Yeah, I mean, you could see this coming because the Supreme Court had largely upheld the president's travel ban because it was perfectly legal under a 1952 statute. All of these other lower court federal judges misinterpreted the law, and that's why they're lower court judges and not sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court. A whole group of people are a lot smarter than sitting federal judges. And so there's no surprise here. This was entirely predictable.
Scott, you're laughing, but what's so funny? I mean, this is the purview of the executive branch of the United States government, and all of a sudden you do have lower court judges who are acting in an activist manner here. It feels like the Supreme Court is trying to clean this up.
Well, maybe not, but I wouldn't say that the lower courts, especially the circuit courts and federal district courts, are less intelligent or less abiding of the law than the Supreme Court. Here's the deal. The 1952 statute that Greg talks about certainly is in place, and it's within the purview of the executive. But no matter what, the executive cannot violate the First Amendment, cannot violate the religious freedoms of individuals, and even those individuals who are attempting to come here, their coming here has to be reviewed within the context of the U.S. Constitution. The lower courts found that it had been offensive and discriminatory, if you will, and it could have been tailored more narrowly
let me ask
to fit
Greg,
that national interest,
how much
if you will.
of the U.S. Constitution applies to non-U.S. citizens?
Well, none of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. None of it does. But if those individuals are attempting to come here as part of the...
If you're living in Iraq and you've never set foot in the United States or Syria or Yemen or any of the countries.
But if you are attempting to come here, part of an immigration program to come into the United States, then your case has to be reviewed, and the First Amendment for the U.S. cannot be violated by the judges or the executive.
Why is it the top 10 Muslim-majority nations in the country, only one was on the travel ban list? I mean, if you're really the Trump administration discriminating against Muslims, how about the other 9 nations that weren't banned from coming to the United States?
I can't tell you why that is, but I can tell you, but it's not a charade. I can tell you that the justices at the lower level certainly didn't believe Donald Trump when he said it was it was religious neutral as the reasons why.
Scott,
because there was no violence or no terrorists coming from those individual countries on U.S. soil.
Now we're going to an area that can certainly be debated, but let's bring Betsy back in.
But there was no threat.
Yeah, my understanding is that this dramatic reduction in the number of refugees coming to the United States doesn't have anything to do with a religious test. Obviously, the First Amendment law involving how the federal government can use a person's religion to let them in is complicated. The points that Greg makes are really important. But this is not a First Amendment question, in my understanding. This is a question about executive power. Did the president have the power to dramatically reduce how many refugees we accept every year? And I'm sure we could debate all night about whether or not it's good policy to dramatically reduce the number of refugees. But we now have a Supreme Court ruling saying that the president was acting within his rights, and that it's something he's allowed to do. It's pretty
Supreme Court rulings, which has said when it comes to national security, the president has plenary power over immigration matters, who comes here and who's not, and who's a threat.
Scott, I'll give you a quick final word, but you keep referring to the lower courts, who I think we should all acknowledge have become politicized, and they have become activists. You know, they're not. They're known for their activist role more so than the roles that they think were initially set up for.
More so than the Supreme Court. That's a presidentship full of presidential appointees. If they're politicized, they're all politicized. But here's the deal. You're absolutely right. The executive has that privilege and has that authority. You're absolutely right about that. But there is no authority and no executive that can exercise that authority and violate the U.S. Constitution in the United States.
We got to leave it there. Thank you all very, very much. We're going to be right back.
Thank you.